Hi, welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Just behind me you see a series of monuments, and I am in Munster, Indiana at Community Veterans Park. This is a memorial that I think has a lot of interesting elements. I first heard about this reading Erica Doss's book, Memorial Mania, and I was doing an article on some memorials in Berlin, and I was particularly curious about this site because I had heard that it does some different things, and so I thought today we'd take a tour here and compare this particular memorial in Munster, Indiana, which is a little bit off the beaten track, I have to say, from metropolitan areas. It's probably about 45-50 minutes from Chicago. It's in northwest Indiana, just off of I-94. So let's take a tour today talking about the significance of how memorials are constructed, particularly ones that focus on the horrors of warfare. Okay, so we'll begin the tour here at Community Veterans Memorial. This, I think, is one of those memorials that, for me, has a lot of significance for a number of reasons. It does cover multiple periods of war or conflict. There's one exhibit on World War I, 3 on World War II, 1 on the Korean War, 1 on Vietnam, and 1 on the Persian Gulf War. And then also there's an ending section that is sort of like maybe portending the future and hoping that there will not be future conflicts in terms of having the need to memorialize warfare. You're seeing some of the dramatic images here, and what I like is they combine abstract sculptures with actual objects, if you will, that have a context of war. This shows you where it's located. So you're seeing Illinois on the left and Indiana on the right. And we'll zoom in a little bit here. So it's in Munster, Indiana. It's just south of Highway 94. So if you're going through Indiana up to Chicago, which was my route on the particular day of visit, it's actually pretty convenient. You can just get off and visit. On my day of visit, it was pretty hot. There isn't a lot of shade here. It's fairly wide open, but they've done a nice job, I think, with some of the grounds. It's free to enter. Really big parking lot. You're seeing here some of the World War II Pacific exhibit, and I think you're noticing very early here in our tour of some of the still images that there's an abstraction here. There's what I would call dark theming going on in terms of some of the sculptures, and they're quite dramatic. And I think what for me was really stunning was the fact that they didn't go for representational context. Just a soldier. You sometimes see this. And they didn't go for abstraction, say in the sense of the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., which there's a lot of opinions on that memorial, particularly in terms of how it maybe has this almost quasi-fascist look to it in terms of the architecture. What I like about this memorial is they've combined a number of different styles. They've created almost these like tableaus or miniature themed spaces, as we're seeing here in Vietnam, with some local, architectural features. You do have, as you'll note here, the traditional plaques. So there is a little bit of information available to the guest during the visit. You're getting a look at another sculpture here. This one I think is a little more traditional as compared to the one in World War II Europe, and this is the Gulf War, and very iconic in terms of what happened with this setting of fires to the oil wells. So it's very iconic in that sense and becomes a symbol. And this is towards the end then, where you see the actual, I guess you could say, the sculpture for the future, and hopefully not having to memorialize warfare in the future. And you see that right there with that shot as well. So, for me, a lot of the power of this memorial comes through the fact that they've created these distinct spaces, these 7 spaces of different wars. Accompanying these are different sculptures, art objects, very small themed spaces, if you will, and a series of narrations that you'll see when you see these buttons that say press to hear history. You get the sense that there's going to be this narrative presented to you. You see the 2 artists who were involved in the project, and I have to say it's just a really wonderful approach to the art. I mean, it's never easy creating this kind of art, but it's, I think, very effective in terms of what it does, the mixing of styles, some abstract, some more representational, all the while, I would say there's a lot of dark theming present. As we look at this push to hear history, we can talk a little bit as we look through some of my video about the how of memorialization. We're looking at right now World War I, and this has a variety of different objects, and I like how they use rubble in here, along with maybe some of the traditional like black granite and the imagery there. You see the plaques, and they're pretty, short, if you will. The text on them is not very extensive. If you do press one of those play to hear history buttons, you get a fairly long recording detailing some of the wars, talking about some of the issues. You also maybe get some patriotic music. The immersive quality just in terms of multimedia, and we're looking at actually the back here, so you see kind of utility area. I always like to get a sense of like the entirety of a particular space, whether it's a memorial or a theme space, a consumer space, whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, there isn't a lot of multimedia, and probably in this case it would distract a little bit if you had a bunch of video screens, if you had that kind of information. I didn't note whether or not there was an app. I don't always get the chance to fully research all these spaces, but I think an app, if it does exist or could exist, would be a good way to offer the guests some context. You could do a very brief GPS locator, and then that could tell you almost like the audio tour in a museum. We're looking at another plaque here as we look at the, I believe this is World War II, the home front that we're seeing, with this sculpture here. This one is definitely, a little more abstract. Now this one here is, I would say, very, quite not horrific looking, but it portrays, I think, the horrors of warfare, right? You look at this particular soldier. I'll zoom ahead here a little bit on the tour, and this one as well, looking at World War II, the Pacific, where you see these hands coming out and you have these body parts. I mean, it's, I think, very effective in the sense that you are able to gain an appreciation of the horrors of war. And in any case, jumping back to that topic I mentioned, the how of memorialization, I think, is a really key topic. So anytime you're dealing with the memory of something, you think about the efforts to rebuild the site of the terrorist attack of 9/11, the memorial, say, in Oklahoma City to the terrorist bombing there. You always have the sense that if there's something very heavy or dark behind the history, then obviously it's going to be a more challenging task. And that's, I think, a big difference when you talk about memorial spaces, monuments, is that there's a seriousness, obviously, to what we're looking at versus if you have a theme space or a consumer space, whether it's a theme park or a casino. Very clearly, because the context is a consumerist one, you don't maybe even get into some of the modes of expression or representation or the issues existentially or politically that we would, quite obviously, in a memorial space or in a space of monuments and so forth. And I think that's pretty obvious, but it also has to be pointed out because it really, I think, behooves us to look at all of these spaces and just how amazing they are to execute, to plan out, to conceptualize, to create. And over time, we're looking at Korea here. This has a more kind of like sense of ruins, and there's like a little cave area to the left that you can walk in. But, it really is quite a challenge because no matter what you do, I remember when in discussions of some of the Holocaust museums or museums of genocide worldwide, one of the key issues that comes up is they plan a particular focus, and then other groups come forward later and say, well, why didn't you address these people, and you didn't talk about this genocide, and you didn't talk about this aspect of history, or the perspective that you offered on this particular era of dark history of genocide, of warfare, whatever, was slanted or biased or lacked another perspective that would give us a different sensibility. And that, as we see in some of the sculpture here, and there is, again, what I would call a lot of dark theming in terms of the representation of death and warfare. It's not certainly pleasant to look at, a lot of it, and I think it's very effective in that sense. But that issue of perspective, when you get into how to create monuments or memorials, is so challenging because obviously the minute you open a space like this, there will be people who maybe do not like the representations or think they've left things out. I've been to museums before, including some of the really good ones in Washington, D.C., where I'll be walking through an exhibit. And I'm thinking of specifically the Smithsonian's Americans. Is it The Price of War or The Price of Freedom? But, that's an exhibit I remember walking through that talks about warfare, but I felt like it was a little one-sided in terms of sort of celebrating, or there was a narrative that ran throughout the exhibition that said the U.S. was reluctantly pulled into wars. And if you study history, if you study political science, you know that it's never a simple matter in terms of why war or conflicts start. And there's still debate to this day as we look here at Vietnam about whether or not that particular war was viable. Was it important to engage in this war in Vietnam? And a lot of people to this day would say it wasn't. It becomes controversial, of course, because when you're talking about veterans, I think if you're critical of a war, you're not necessarily being critical of the veterans involved in the war. And that very issue itself, the fact that we have to kind of think carefully about our language and the politics of what we're saying, is I think why these exact spaces that we're viewing today here, in this case in Munster, Indiana, are so challenging to create and to maintain, because they're imbued with all sorts of meanings, many of which we will not agree with. If you think about 2018, where we stand today in the realm of the Trump presidency, if you get on social media, I know this happens to me on Facebook, there's a lot of discord over the direction of the country. So it shouldn't surprise us, perhaps, that when we think about these types of representations, focusing on dark periods of history, on warfare, on violence, on genocide, that somehow these spaces will open and everybody will be happy with the representations, what's presented, and so forth. I have to say I haven't had a chance to look at a lot of these, say, Yelp or TripAdvisor information to see people's views. I know, reading some of the academic literature, there's a lot of referencing of Community Veterans Memorial and a lot of positivity, I think, about what it does. It's over 6.5 acres. I don't have the actual costs of construction handy with me, but when you walk through the space, and I think even seeing some of my video today, just imagine the cost of one of these sculptures, just this figure here and perhaps the figure on the ground. That itself, in terms of creating a sculpture out of metal, using a foundry or whatever. I mean, it takes, hundreds and hundreds of hours to do this. Of course, artistic skill. So multiply that times all the sculptures, add in all the tableaus here, all the structures they've created, these plaques, these miniature themed spaces, some of that audio-visual material, as well as the very significant real objects they involve, the helicopter, the aircraft, and so forth, the howitzer. I mean, it's just very expensive to pull something like this off. And so I think it's another indication of the challenges of, say, memorial spaces or monumental spaces, because in some cases, there may be a reluctance by the public to support a space like this. And I encourage you to go online. You can look at the main website for Community Veterans Memorial, and you could certainly donate. You could look at the list of donors. There are many donors. When I looked, there were hundreds listed. And I think it's often, a labor of love for many people in terms of donating to a cause like this one. Now, here's the book I'll mention throughout my conversations with you today. Erica Doss's Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America, University of Chicago Press. And it was in that book when I was reading it, a wonderful book, by the way, where I first learned of this memorial. I happened to be back in the Midwest visiting family, and I said to my wife, we have to go and visit, because I just think this is going to be one of those that's going to be pretty impressive to see. And after walking through the space, I definitely was impressed. I definitely felt like what I had seen was very significant. It was something that certainly I would recommend that you visit if you get a chance to take a trip to Northwest Indiana. So now let's switch to some on-site commentary at the space. 'All 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 Okay, so we're taking a look here at, this is the future monument here, and I think this is one that maybe sort of portends the horrors of warfare in the future. And then we're also moving through here, and you can see, if you've had a chance to just see some of the sculptures here, they're rather postmodern in nature. I would actually say dark. In an abstract sense, not as abstract as, say, Eisenman's Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, nor Daniel Liebeskind's famous garden that you see at the Jewish Museum, also in Berlin. So the structure here, you see a lot of the sculptures have an accompanying plaque, I guess you could say, that describes things often in abstract details. So this talks about the symbolism of the sculpture and puts that into context for the visitor. As you could see, it has a more abstract focus, I think. I generally associate war memorials, not in Europe, but in the US, with more representational approaches. This is focused on the Gulf War, a map. There's often accompanying map, and they've chosen some key symbols. What you're seeing here, of course, the Iraqi army set fire to many of the oil wells. Werner Herzog actually did a film on sort of the dramatic environmental catastrophe behind that. So they've chosen, I guess, in some respects, key symbols. Particularly, we're looking back here at the Vietnam monument, and what they did there, and I'll play some of that video for you, is to actually use what they define as key symbols to orient the guest within that tableau, within that space, focused on, in this case, the Vietnam War and American sacrifices. And the other thing you'll note on the ground is there's a timeline, and it looks like they have dedication bricks as well. And one of the things I think that is impressive is they've combined sculpture with real, in this case, you know, a helicopter. And at World War I, just down the way, they have a howitzer, a cannon that you know, combines with the sculpture. So I think they've done a good job in terms of doing some abstract and hybrid forms of sculpture here at the memorial in Munster, Indiana. You see here on the right, Korea. And I'll probably intersperse here in post-production some of my other footage I've shot on the Blackmagic camera, and there's this annoying spot on my lens, and so we'll see how that looks. But as I said earlier, you can see there's a plaque here for each of the memorials that are presented. And it's a rather hot day here in Munster, so I'm trying to move fast. I'm just sweating and sweating. It's not a shady spot when you visit here. It is, I have to say, they've done a pretty remarkable job just in terms of the landscaping. It's yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd describe it as peaceful. This, I think, is one of the more powerful ones. It has just a real see another example, right, of combining the real object, the airplane, with the sculpture. And the sculpture itself is quite striking. For some reason, it reminds me a little bit of, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but it reminds me a little bit of the two Tetsuo Japanese cyberpunk horror films, just in terms of some of the creatures there. And again, I think what they're trying to do here is to use more postmodern approaches to sculpture to make a point about the horrors of war. You see disembodiment here, kind of showing you the toll, someone who survived and someone who was lost in the war. Images, actual images of war as well. This is the home front here. Go over to the home front, and then over here we have Europe. Again, each of these has an accompanying plaque, and you can also use the audio to get a bit more context. And I think that's one of the things about this park that is unique. And you just see across the road here, it's really in, residential area. There's the sign, Community Veterans Memorial. But, one of the things they do that is maybe a little non-traditional is they give you the audio guides that accompany each of the 7 memorials, and I think that's quite different. It ranges, not all of them have the key symbols that they offer, say, at Vietnam, which I thought was pretty cool. Here we're looking at World War I. So again, note the cannon, the howitzer, note the use of different materials here. And then, this sort of facade in the front, I think, maybe more traditional in terms of what you expect at a memorial with some of the marble. Again, you see some of the abstraction here, representation of death and the horrors of war. But yeah, having those audio reminders, audio guides that accompany each of the sculptures, I think is a pretty unique way to approach things. You hear music, you hear a little bit about the history of the war. In the case of Vietnam, you hear a lot about the symbolism and how things were chosen. And so it's something additional that you can think about in terms of design when you're focusing maybe on creating a memorial. And probably a memorial space is one of the most challenging ones to create when you think about the politics behind not just the representation, but how guests are going to interact with the site and so forth. So a lot to think about here today at Community Veterans Memorial in Munster, Indiana. Okay, as we close our considerations and our visit today to Community Veterans Memorial in Munster, Indiana, I hope you'll have the opportunity to reflect more critically as well as personally on some of the issues of space that come up when we memorialize horrific periods of war, periods of dark history, of genocide, or any other issues that have this inherently political and disturbing context to them. So give your thoughts on the comments on this YouTube video, and I hope you have a chance to visit some of these important spaces in your future travels, wherever they may take you. So I hope you enjoyed the video feature today here at Community Veterans Memorial in Munster, Indiana, looking at the significance of this rather postmodern memorial to wars of the United States. Please come back for additional video features of the Immersive World Handbook.